Hello and welcome to another episode of the Energy Talk podcast. My name is Olupumi Olajide and thank you so much for joining us for another week. This is episode 2 of our 8-part series on distributed energy for people and the planet, which is co-produced by the Global SDG 7 Hubs and the Energy Action Project. Before I hand over to our host for this episode, Marilyn Smith, I want to share a little anecdote. At the start of this year, I joined a company that works directly with off-grid electrification, and I've had the amazing opportunity to visit so many communities that have never been served by the national grid in Nigeria. And seeing the impact that energy has on their homes, businesses, and their way of life has been incredible. And a lot of the themes from this episode reflect very much to the work that I do on a day-to-day. And even though I really appreciate the opportunity for the work I do, I've also been close to the very hard work it takes to actually get everything required for energy to reach remote communities. So I hope this episode is something that's enlightening as we dive into topics around agriculture, animal husbandry, and shaping policy, technology, and getting the right type of financing to meet the people where they are, and making sure that impact and SDG 7 is equitable across board. So without any further ado, let's go to Marilyn and introduce our guests.
Eking out a living on 2 hectares of land in rural India is, in one word, intense. The growing season falls between the intense heat of the dry season and the intense rains of the monsoon. It means intense manual labor across seeding, growing, and harvesting, and, in the end, intense worry about getting produce to markets and getting a fair price once there. If just one thing goes wrong, the ripple effect can be devastating, as evidenced by high rates of suicide among smallhold farmers. Increasingly, as we heard in episode 1 of this series, intense weather linked to climate change is upping the ante. In recent years, heat stress has killed off 30% of chicks and left cows producing 30% less milk. Yet small-scale farmers remain the backbone of food production across India, making up 60 to 80%, depending on sources, of agriculture and animal husbandry. Improving access to both clean, affordable energy and energy-efficient equipment and services is critical for this sector. Beyond sustaining these livelihoods, distributed renewables have potential to substantially improve them. To give us insights into both aspects of this challenge, we've brought together 2 innovators working in complementary spaces. Ganesh Neelam is Director of Collectives for Integrated Livelihood Initiatives, or CINI, a program launched by the Tata Trusts. A geoscientist and hydrologist by training, Ganesh has been active in energy access for agriculture and livelihoods for several years. Huda Jaffer, director of Selco Foundation, developed a keen interest in user-centric design for sustainability and development issues while pursuing a degree in integrated design management. Recently, Ganesh and Huda have been collaborating with a broader range of creative thinkers to tackle the wide range of interrelated challenges and opportunities in agriculture. In the first part of this conversation, we'll be posing questions primarily to Ganesh about ongoing challenges. We'll then bring in Huda to explore solutions. Ganesh, can you start by helping our listeners better understand the reality of India's small-scale farmers?
They face a lot of challenges vis-a-vis getting quality services, be it inputs, be it irrigation, be it the market connection, because they are again fragmented into 2 small land parcels to look at. The first and foremost challenge that these small and marginal farmers basically face are that most of their land parcels are rain fed. So it's hardly say 8 to 10% under irrigation across the country, wherein you see these small and marginal farmers actually depending on agriculture as a livelihood. And because they are highly rain fed dependent, only when the rain comes they are able to do agriculture. And after the rainfall, the land is mainly fallow. They then migrate to the urban centers to earn their livings. The normal trend is what one sees is before the monsoon season, the families will come back to the villages. During the monsoon season, they will basically spend those 4 or 5 months to do agriculture in their farms. And once the farm is harvested, which is mainly with the staple crops like maize or paddy in this case, Once the farm is harvested, they'll basically look at opportunities to go back to the urban sectors to earn a next level of livelihood. So a lot of distress migration happens within these small and marginal families. Most of the agriculture that they do, which is rain fed, is all for food security. There's hardly any surplus that they're able to sell it into the open markets for basically getting some monies out of it. The second livelihood that they have is livestock, which is mainly the combination of the large ruminants and small ruminants. But there again, the challenge is no quality health services that they are able to get within the villages. There's a lot of mortality that happens to the animals. So they're not able to manage these animals to see that the animals are able to yield a better return in terms of milk or say meat for the families. As I said, basically because the lands are highly fragmented, they're not able to also look at a certain volume which they're able to go and negotiate with a say a market player. Along that, we also see opportunities. They are, I would say, highly aspirational. So one should not say that because their lands are fragmented and they always depend on rainfall, their aspirations are not there. They do have aspirations for themselves as well as their families. And one is trying to see how one can build along these aspirations from a long term perspective.
You've just made a vital point, Ganesh. Well, policy planning and development strategies have to consider the statistics of there being millions of smallhold farmers in India. That is millions of people with dreams and aspirations for themselves and their children. Where's the opportunity for organizations such as CINI to make a difference?
You are able to say that yes, there is a pain point that the small and marginal farmer is facing, and the pain point could be addressed with a certain action. So, like for example, if it is agriculture, one is trying to see how we can improve practices for the families to enhance the yields. For example, even the staple crops. So, when we get into agriculture specifically in the agriculture value chain, one is trying to address those pain points and see how the family's income could be enhanced in a systematic manner. Now, just to give an example, the Lakpati Kisan program that we have been implementing for the last 5 to 6 years, there we saw that the families have an aspiration to earn an annual income of more than 100,000 rupees. Now, that becomes about 1800, 1700, 1800 US dollars per annum as an annual income. To achieve that annual income at the family level, what we basically as an organization did was to look at a livelihood layer. So look at agriculture with livestock, or we look at agriculture, livestock with non-timber forest produce. So each of these layers we were trying to combine at the family level so that the combination of livelihood is something that enables them to become lakpatis in an irreversible manner.
How does access to affordable energy come into play in relation to the layer of livelihood from farming or agriculture?
Water is going to be an important aspect if one has to talk about agriculture or even livestock to that matter. So we were able to create these irrigation assets like a farm pond, a bore well, or a dug well for the families to see how they can use this water for their livelihoods. But we faced an important challenge of energy being a issue at the family level to see how they can extract this water. And these geographies where we mostly work are mainly dependent on diesel power for looking at how they can extract water even for agriculture in this sense. The grid line is nearly not there in most of these geographies that we work. That's why dependency on fossil fuel is something which is the most opportunity that they have in their area. Now, fossil fuel again has its own challenges vis-a-vis the prices. If the prices are high and they are using at least 4 to 5 irrigations, the families will not be able to earn a reasonably good return from the agriculture that they are doing if they use such a high level of input or investment to do agriculture. And that's where we basically, as a team, with a lot of support from Selco Foundation, were able to see how renewable energy can address that gap.
Are there any specific pain points at which distributed renewables become game changers in relation to agricultural livelihoods?
What we basically learned was how do we remove this fossil fuel from the livelihood chain or the agriculture value chain and bring in renewable energy as an important enabler. We again looked at the value chain from a pre-production, production, and a post-production stage, and we looked at each stage how renewable energy becomes an important fit for the families to adopt and then see how they can grow in this whole process. So that's broadly what we are doing of integrating renewable energy as an important enabler for the families to meet their aspirations in this case. We basically through some of the applications want to get food at our home, and it's very easy for us to do from an application perspective to look at. We were trying to see if similar steps could be taken from a small and marginal farmer's perspective as well. So for a farmer, if he or she wants to do agriculture, at doorstep she is able to get the quality inputs. So be it healthy seedlings, be it fertilizers, be it even irrigation for the family to get at doorstep. How do we enable those ecosystems to provide those services at doorstep of a small and marginal farmer? And finally, the market also comes to the doorstep rather than the family wanting to take the produce and go and sell it in the market. How do we enable these small and marginal farmers to come together as groups and aggregate the produce and see that the produce is then engaged with a stakeholder or a buyer with a negotiation power at the group level? Once the buyer is coming at the doorstep and picking up the produce, it is something which empowers the families as well to say that they can do agriculture in a more systematic manner. That's something that we have learned in our journey while working with the small and marginal farmers, how renewable energy is an important enabler for them to grow, and how these aspects of quality service delivery at doorstep of a small and marginal farmer can help them grow and basically meet their aspirations.
Huda, I think this idea of small scale farmers operating at the doorstep aligns well with a key principle of Selco Foundation. While we often hear in Western circles talk about last mile energy services, Selco Foundation prefers the term first mile solutions. Can you tell us a bit about why, and importantly, how that changes what you do in the agriculture and animal husbandry sectors?
Typically, when one looks at an agricultural or an allied value chain, it has been designed, as Ganesh sir was also alluding, it has been designed keeping markets in mind and keeping heavily centralized markets in mind. Agriculture is probably the only sector where the key producer does not get to set the price of their produce. So, in general, every time that someone refers to a last mile end user, because they're producers, they should be first mile. If one takes a step back and considers that systems were put in place given some of the larger challenges of the time when incentives were provided to go centralized, right? Be it famines at the time when we were going through the Green Revolution. Yes, maybe at the time it warranted that the producer was considered as a last mile citizen. But I think when we look at it today and when we consider what we're going through over the past few decades, be it the climate crisis and climate vulnerability, and be it just the very fragile nature of agriculture and small and marginal farmers in the country, it becomes so important to design systems centered around these small and marginal farmers. It becomes so important to think through the kind of challenges and climate vulnerabilities that the farmers are going to face and ensure that any kind of solution that we work on very squarely targets a transformational impact for small and marginal farmers.
Ganesh, when working with these small scale farmers, do you have a sense that they understand climate change in relation to the traditional ways they've been farming for decades or perhaps even centuries?
I suppose all of us need to understand that the small and marginal farmers are also smart. And unfortunately, everybody feels that they do not know what is happening and we should go and teach them. But as part of the Lakpati Kisan program, we basically work with these small and marginal farmers, mainly the women, to enable them to do tomato cultivation during the monsoon seasons. So they have been doing tomato cultivation for the last 5 to 6 years in the field. To our surprise, they were also able to observe how the yields on a year by year basis are getting stagnated. And that stagnation, they were able to relate it from a soil health perspective. The point that Huda mentioned, that when one talks about soil health, one only looks at nitrogen, phosphorus, and phosphate, NPK, in potassium in this case. But these small and marginal farmers were also able to see that because tomato cultivation on a year by year basis you're doing in the field, there is a stagnation to the yield because the biomass in the soil or the carbon in the soil and the micronutrients in the soil are something that they have been not able to focus or strengthen on. They are also observing how there is this variation that is happening within the soil, which is linked to the yield perspective. So we basically did an exercise with them from a systems thinking perspective. Now, again, systems thinking, uh, You and I would visualize it from a very theoretical exercise of diagrams going here and there. We basically try to engage with them and say, "Ki, okay, if you are doing tomato and if you continue doing tomato in the same land parcel, how would the yields, say, 4 years, 5 years down the line, look at?" So they were able to draw those diagrams at their end to say whether the yields will go down, it will remain same, or it will go high. If it is going down, what has to be done? So those are again engagements that one has to closely do with these small and marginal farmers, mainly with the women, I would say. And you are able to get a lot of learning from them to see. Once we get those learnings, it is easy for them to build up those action plans rather than something which we are able to push from our side. So that's something that we are trying. It's still a journey to learn and see how we can move ahead with the communities in this case.
For the most part, the farmers we've been talking about so far have little access to energy or to equipment that would make their work easier or boost their productivity. How do electricity and technology come into play?
Just as examples that Ganesh sir was providing, one way to look at it is looking at powering existing value chains, which I think is not transformational in many ways. But the opportunity that clean energy combined with energy efficient appliances brings is to further decentralize and distribute inputs and outputs. I'll just give an example very shortly, right? Like if you are looking at powering, say, the dairy value chain, you have the producer, which is the small and marginal dairy farmer that's doing the milking and providing the milk. If I'm going to make the job of that producer better in terms of drudgery removal, so I'm providing a clean energy driven milking machine or a pressure pump to ensure that that livelihood itself is aspirational and that they can grow on a certain trajectory, right? But beyond that, when you actually decentralize things like feed and fodder, the input side for these cows, or you actually decentralize sweet meat making, right? The actual sort of value addition bit. You're transforming ownership and you're truly looking at decentralized and distributed models, really serving local production and consumption. And COVID was a testament to how centralized and very heavily centralized value chains failed at multiple levels. So I think somewhere the opportunity that clean energy brings when you keep your first mile or your user centric systems at the focal point, it kind of really brings an opportunity to decentralize and distribute solutions, both from a people perspective as well as a climate lens.
As compared with what it takes to extend electricity grids into remote or underserved areas, the ability to match local demand and supply through distributed renewables is truly transformational. But it isn't happening very quickly or easily on large scales. What's missing?
In terms of large scale deployment, we have been looking at with partners like CINI, like Social Alpha, Sustain Plus. We've been looking at how do we evolve ecosystems, right? How do we create enabling conditions so that stakeholders can be better geared to serve these end users and prioritize the need of the end users. The first and most critical stakeholder is supply side enterprises, right? These are the enterprises that are catering to the farmer, that are catering to that woman entrepreneur that's running that rural business, right? How do we incentivize them to better create efficient, need based, gender neutral technologies that can actually solve problems on the ground? Whether it's something as simple as a transplanter or a paddy thresher, or it's something as simple as a rice huller or an oil mill, which to a large extent, Madeline, are not only completely missing in some sense, but are also extremely inefficient and very ancient. A lot of innovation has not happened on these technologies per se. Looking at good R&D, high risk funds for these technology providers to innovate from a need based perspective. The second piece is kind of a game changer or a silver bullet we've seen, and I'm sure Ganesh would sort of echo the same, is access to finance. Access to long term, asset based, low IRR, risk friendly finance, which really kind of allows people to adopt these solutions and use these solutions one way or the other. And the third one, and the most essential one, is policy. I do feel like providing sticks and carrots in the right place, having subsidies which are smart and which are not counterproductive to a lot of these efforts, just channeling subsidies more towards clean energy and clean energy driven applications rather than fossil fuel. These are things which really can push and pull both demand and supply to kind of increase the scale at which we are accelerating and the SDGs that we need to meet. There isn't much time, and given the urgency of it, I think these three factors can really spur other conditions on the ground per se: technology, finance, and policies.
In my intro to this episode, I mentioned that heat stress is already having serious impacts for small scale farmers, such as high mortality for chicks and drastically lower milk production. What else do you see emerging as pain points?
I think climate change has been there for decades, though one is trying to talk about it more proactively now with the frequent changes that are happening. Because earlier also there were changes which maybe we did not notice them that strongly. Even now, if you see, like for a country like India, across geographies within the country, hardly 20 to 30% is something which is under irrigation. So there is a high dependence on rainfall. Even if there is an irrigation source, the agriculturist, in this case, the small and marginal farmer, will put more efforts towards the rainfall based agriculture. And the point that I mentioned about 4 to 5 months putting all their effort and energy to cultivate a staple crop during the monsoon season, the monsoon has become fairly erratic in the last few years. So you don't see monsoon actually coming in June. It's going to July, or in some cases even to August. And that's how the season that has to start in June, mainly the transplanting of different crops, does not happen. It basically stretches the farmer to what you call not able to do anything during the month of June. If some farmers have irrigation asset, they're able to start with, but they also fear that if there is a long dry spell, what will I do from a next irrigation perspective to the crop? So this is a big issue that we are seeing in the field, wherein the erraticity of the rainfall has created a problem of actually when the transplanting should happen. That's the reason when the transplanting gets delayed, the harvesting gets delayed. So if a paddy crop has to start in June and you have to harvest it say by end of October or November, now the transplanting is going till the first half of August. And that's why you are basically harvesting it in December, which basically does not allow the family, even if they want to do a second crop, it does not allow the family to do a second crop because you are actually lost 2 months of the second crop season to look at. The second important change that we are seeing is the temperature rise during the months of February, March, and those months. The temperatures have not been so high the way they are in the last few years that we are seeing. Now, because the temperature goes high, that's also a time when the crop basically is in a fruiting stage. It impacts the crop during that time, which ultimately results in a challenge from a lower yield perspective or maybe a pest attack perspective. Those are changes or variations that we are seeing from a field perspective on the ground.
Once you identify such a pain point, how do you start to intervene?
What we basically are trying to do to see how we can address this from the community perspective is to work with the families on how they can plan their cropping season. And if there is a possibility of us to create more irrigation assets or more water harvesting structures, even if they are able to hold water, then with the proper planning, I think the point that both Huda and I were talking about, how do we enable them to get those quality services at their doorstep when they need it? So be it from a finance perspective, be it from a quality input perspective, if they are able to get those services at their doorstep, then for them a certain level of risk is also something that they're able to manage and take up the agriculture season in a systematic and a proactive manner, which to some extent helps them address this issue of low rainfall or a long dry spell. We are also trying to see if we can bring in new technologies to see if the soil moisture could be held for a long duration. If we are able to irrigate once, there are certain solutions which can help them keep the soil moisture for a long duration. So you don't need irrigation again. You are able to maybe avoid one irrigation. These are again new technologies that one has to regularly look at to see how that can help the farmers from their livelihood perspective.
In the first episode of this series, both Harish Hande of Selco Foundation and Gauri Singh of the International Renewable Energy Agency, or IRENA, talked about the importance of working with and learning from communities. What has been your experience with smallhold farmers, Ganesh?
One of the most important points that we are trying to do, again, climate, a big word for these families. Now, they basically would want to understand it in a much simpler manner or a simpler language. Unfortunately, the jargons are something which most of us try to put across, but nobody tries to simplify it from an end user's perspective or a first mile perspective. We are also trying to work with them to see how we can simplify this for them to have their own action plans ready with, rather than somebody coming and putting an action plan. They are able to build their own action plans as an institution or a group from a ground perspective. A lot of learning to come from the communities, also from the ecosystem, to see how we can empower these communities to address the climate related aspects from a long term perspective.
Huda, from your experience in product, systems, and service design, and your role at Selco Foundation, what can you bring to help people develop their own action plans?
I think this kind of seamlessly allows me to build on what Ganesh sir was mentioning, which are the ground realities, whether it's erratic monsoons or droughts that people are facing, and specifically heat stress as well, right? Most of these action plans are trying to shield people from extreme drudgery, right? They're trying to ensure that the quality of yield and the quantity of yield is maintained. And more so, I think, specifically when it comes to agriculture, the role of storage, value addition plays a big role, right? Because when you're talking about markets as well, how do you kind of prevent distress selling? How do you kind of prevent complete crop losses as well? These are the three areas which I think we've been focusing and working on. But when you add the climate lens, unfortunately, most of the solutions and technologies today, as Ganesh sir was mentioning, are not really designed from a very end user and climate centric perspective. Just to give you an example, if, say, an action plan was to be developed on coming up with better practices for fertilizers, most of the soil testing units could be solar powered soil testing units, but they are not geared for assessing biological composition, just the chemical compositions of soil. Similarly, when you talk about solar agri processing, post harvest processing, typically very centralized, very difficult to access. But whether it's post harvest processing or cold storages, like let's say 5 to 15 metric ton, they allow the end user some autonomy before they can actually give them to pack houses or reefer vehicles. Many of these technologies are not geared towards decentralized decision making. Just to give you another example, when you're trying to sort of work on a decentralized rice mill, traditionally the rice mill that's closest to the end users cannot process different varieties of rice. It's only geared towards processing one variety of rice. So even if the community decides that they want to grow other varieties of rice, which is actually very in line with climate goals, they cannot do it because they cannot get it processed. These are sort of systems and products and services that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at people's action plans, needs, and demands, as well as a climate lens very squarely within that.
Without really stating it as such, we've been talking today about overlapping ecosystems, that of millions of smallhold farmers, that of technology development and employment, and that of government action to stimulate large-scale change. In this bid to increase livelihoods of small-scale farmers, advance the clean energy transition, and boost food security, are there any sweet spots that could be captured quickly by aligning effective technology, strategic policy, and the kind of risk-friendly financing that Huda mentioned earlier?
The sweet spot I see is these partnership opportunities that enable most of us to work together and see how we can engage closely with the end user. I would say from an Indian perspective, who are basically wanting to come together with their own level of expertise. For example, Selco Foundation is pioneer in looking at decentralized renewable energy, not only from a installation perspective, but also from an efficiency perspective in a more systematic manner. An organization like CINI, because of its strong ground presence, understands the community perspective. And both of us coming together is to see how we can understand the pain points of the communities in a more easier and a systematic manner, and come up with some possible solutions which are also adaptable at the community level.
I'm going to just add one more sweet spot, which I also think could be a very strong tipping point, is that there is appetite with decision makers and government and policy makers to really say, how do we design these incentives and these better policies which are in line with moving towards better practices. There are champions in place in key decision making positions that are asking for what needs to be done and how it can be done. I do feel like it's time practitioners sort of double down on the seriousness of providing appropriate recommendations and models and solutions to the sector, be it the investment space, the government space. I do see that as the sweet spot and both the tipping point that can really move us towards institutionalizing better practices that are geared towards farmers and the climate, of course.
Do either of you see any tipping points where breakdown of one ecosystem could have negative effects on the others?
So I think taking a point to what Buddha just mentioned in terms of the policy, she explained it from a positive perspective, and I'm trying to put it from a negative perspective as well. For example, there are these technologies which we are able to do at a certain scale, and one is seeing a very good benefit from an end user's perspective from a decentralized renewable energy solution. We basically try to engage with the government system to see if we can create some good models or schemes around them for them to see how it becomes a scalable approach from the government perspective. A flip side of it could be that because it gets into a scheme, it gets very standardized, and unfortunately when it gets standardized, you're not able to play with some level of innovation and opportunity that you have, and then it goes across the ecosystem in that standardized manner as a proper scheme or a program, which should have some variations depending on a geography, depending on the type of community it is. Unfortunately, that does not happen. So that's, I would say, a flip side of looking at it. But as Huda mentioned, within the country, there are certain states or districts in that particular state wherein the leadership is very positive to make those variations or changes. And we are hoping that it basically then expands across geographies.
How can organizations like CINI and Selco Foundation have an influence in states where the transformation is lagging?
Just wanted to emphasize on the point of the Sustain Plus program, which basically Selco Foundation, CINI, and Social Alpha together started from a perspective of building on the capabilities of an organization like Selco Foundation, who's done so much innovations from a ground perspective and have been able to experiment with those innovations and seeing a positive response from the community. So from that experimentation, how do we take it to a scale is what Sustain Plus looks at. So the scale was something that we said it's very important from an execution perspective that we can bring in within the larger ecosystem rather than only talking about experimentation and piloting, because organizations do pilots and you spend a lot of effort and energy to see that the pilot successes. When it goes to a scale, it has its own challenges, and that's what Sustain Plus tries to address, those challenges from a scale perspective, with next level of engagement with like-minded organizations coming together and trying to see from a scale perspective with decentralized renewable energy.
I just wanted to add one point, Marilyn, on the negative tipping points. I think this is something that will set us back multifold, is the way in which philanthropy operates in the sector. So I do think that the opportunity here is to think long term, to think systemic, to really think resilience and mitigation from a long term perspective. Whereas most of philanthropy, unfortunately, is not thinking the way in which it should be from a long term and end user centric perspective. It is often siloed, short term, it is often sort of ticking check boxes. So I think we need to move beyond the metric of reach and really look at more transformational philanthropy, because philanthropy is actually the one part that can afford to really demonstrate, take risks, and showcase a more longer term change on the ground for governments and private sectors to pick up. I think that is one piece that can really set us back if philanthropy doesn't play its role that it should be.
The risk of reaching tipping points, both positive and negative, related to climate change and the agriculture and animal husbandry sectors is likely to increase in the near future, and likely to affect the most vulnerable people first and more forcefully. Across the global south, that means millions of smallhold farmers. As we heard today, many governments, corporations, NGOs, and philanthropists need to implement better strategies across technology, policy, and financing. Many also need to start from a fundamentally different position than they have in the past. That is, recognizing the communities they aim to help are smart and resilient. As both Huda Jaffer of Selco Foundation and Ganesh Neelam of Collectives for Integrated Livelihood Initiatives, or CINI, confirm, smallhold farmers need to be recognized as active partners rather than passive beneficiaries. Next up, in Distributed Energy for People and the Planet, we talk to two more people and entities already practicing this approach. McKenna Areri, Director of Clean Energy Access Research at CLASP, will help us dig into the importance of innovation in low-energy, efficient appliances for use with off-grid electricity systems. Supriya Gowda, Project Manager for Agriculture at Selco Foundation, will provide insights in how to align comprehensive, cost-effective programs and strategic partnerships, and about her own experience as a weekend farmer. Don't forget, episode 1 of this 8-part series is already live, with Selco Foundation's Harish Hande and Gauri Singh of the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, discussing the critical intersect of practical solutions and policy action. Find us here every second week on The Energy Talk. For the Energy Action Project, EnAct, I'm Marilyn Smith.